What if I told you that 3 women with royal titles, 2 princesses born into the House of Windsor and a duchess once married to a prince, might never again set foot inside the gates of Buckingham Palace? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. That, behind the formality and carefully managed press releases, the royal family just quietly slammed the door shut on Princess Eugenie, Princess Beatrice, and their mother Sarah Ferguson? This isn't just another rumor cooked up by tabloids. Because this time, the reason behind their alleged exile is more disturbing than any royal scandal in recent memory. According to newly resurfaced emails reportedly sent by Jeffrey Epstein, Sarah Ferguson not only had financial ties to the disgraced financier, she may have actually celebrated his release from prison, alongside her daughters. That's right. Epstein claimed in written correspondence that Sarah Ferguson, Princess Beatrice, and Princess Eugenie were all present at what can only be described as a grotesque welcome back gathering following his early release from his 2008 conviction, when the world already knew what kind of man he was. Now, think about that for a moment. This is not a minor tabloid leak or some unverified Twitter rumor. These are claims tied to one of the darkest chapters in modern elite history, the Epstein network. And they don't just implicate a socialite or a business mogul. They touch the bloodline of the British royal family. So the question becomes, what did King Charles discover? And when that made him finally say enough is enough? What pushed him to take the drastic step of reportedly cutting off not just his scandal-ridden brother Prince Andrew, but also the Duke's ex-wife and their daughters? And more urgently, if these emails are real, what else hasn't come to light yet? Welcome to one of the most explosive stories to shake the monarchy in years. This video will take you inside the unraveling of a quiet royal fracture, one that's been brewing beneath the surface of polished family portraits and smiling balcony appearances. We'll break down exactly what was said in those Epstein emails, why the timing of their emergence matters, and what led to the apparent banishment of 3 high-profile royals from the palace. We're not here to speculate wildly. We're here to ask hard questions, sift through verifiable facts, and paint a picture of how an old institution is desperately trying to protect its future, even if it means burning bridges with its own family. But before we begin dissecting the timeline and connecting the dots, let's be clear about one thing. This isn't just a story about Epstein. It's a story about access, about proximity to power, and about how closely certain members of the British royal family came to brushing up against one of the most reviled men of the 21st century, long after the rest of the world already knew who he really was. And somehow, despite the headlines, this particular royal connection has slipped under the radar until now. Let's rewind the tape. Over the last decade, the public has witnessed the slow, public crumbling of Prince Andrew's reputation. From the disastrous BBC Newsnight interview in 2019 to his forced step back from public duties, Andrew has become something of a ghost within royal circles. You won't see him at major events anymore. His military titles are gone. His reputation is in ashes. And yet, for years, Sarah Ferguson, his ex-wife, continued to appear at Windsor events, sometimes even by the Queen's side. Her daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, though technically not working royals, were still very much part of the extended public face of the monarchy. Charity events, royal weddings, balcony appearances. Even if they weren't on the taxpayer payroll, they were treated by many as members of the royal inner circle. That era might be over, because according to multiple sources close to the palace, King Charles, who has long been pushing for a leaner, more scandal-free monarchy, is said to be furious over these new Epstein revelations. He's reportedly made it clear that any associations with Epstein, however peripheral, are toxic, and anyone who entertained those ties will face consequences. And that includes Sarah Ferguson. That includes Beatrice. And that includes Eugenie. So how did we get here? To understand that, we have to start with a series of events that many hoped had already been buried. But as we're about to find out, nothing stays buried for long. Let's talk about the email. Leaked documents recently revealed alleged correspondence between Jeffrey Epstein and an unnamed associate in which he refers to Sarah Ferguson by name, as having stopped by to say hello after his release. He then allegedly describes the moment as a small gathering that included her and her daughters. Now pause for a second. This wasn't Epstein before his crimes were made public. This was after he was convicted, after he was labeled a sex offender, after he served jail time for the abuse of underage girls. And still, if the email is accurate, members of the royal family chose to associate with him. The question that hangs over this is simple but damning. Why? Why would a mother, who had once been married to the Queen's son, associate herself and her children with a man like Epstein? Was it ignorance, denial, or something else? We'll explore all those possibilities in detail later in the video. But for now, here's what we know. This wasn't Sarah Ferguson's first scandal involving Epstein. Back in 2011, it was revealed that Epstein had helped pay off some of Ferguson's personal debts. At the time, she publicly apologized and called it a gigantic error of judgment. But now, these new emails suggest that her ties to him didn't end with that payment. If anything, they may have been deeper. And if her daughters were involved, even peripherally, that changes everything. Remember, Beatrice and Eugenie are not private citizens in the traditional sense. They carry titles. They represent a lineage. Whether they like it or not, they are symbols of the British monarchy. And when they show up at events, public or private, they represent something much larger than themselves. Which is why, according to insiders, King Charles made the call to cut them off. Quietly, firmly, and indefinitely. There's no official press release. No headline screaming, Beatrice and Eugenie banned. That's not how the palace works. But the signs are there. Sudden absences from events. Invitations that no longer arrive. Cold distance where once there was warmth. This isn't just about public relations. It's about legacy. King Charles is aware that the monarchy is walking a tightrope. Public trust is fragile. Younger generations are increasingly skeptical of royal privilege. Every scandal chips away at the institution's relevance. And so, when faced with even a hint that members of his own family may have socialized with Epstein after his conviction, Charles chose the nuclear option. Cut ties. Eliminate risk. Protect the crown. And so here we are. The public may not fully understand the depth of the split yet. Many still see Beatrice and Eugenie as harmless royals with charming smiles. But behind the scenes, the palace machinery has already moved on. The door has closed. And unless something dramatic changes, it's not opening again anytime soon. In the sections to come, we'll go deeper into every corner of this story. We'll examine Sarah Ferguson's history with Epstein in chilling detail. We'll question what Princess Beatrice and Eugenie knew and when. We'll uncover how the royal family responded behind the scenes, and how this one scandal could reshape the monarchy's future. But before we move on, ask yourself, if the palace really did ban 3 family members over this, what else are they willing to hide? Because this isn't just a royal embarrassment. This could be the crack in the foundation. For decades, the British royal family has been one of the most carefully curated brands on the planet. It operates less like a family and more like a living institution, wrapped in tradition, ceremony, and polished PR. Every appearance, every photo op, every official statement is choreographed to protect the image of dignity, stability, and moral integrity. At the center of this illusion are the working royals, the core members of the family who represent the monarchy across the Commonwealth. But just outside that core exists a circle of relatives who bear titles, enjoy privileges, and carry the royal name, without necessarily being in the spotlight every day. This is where Princess Beatrice, Princess Eugenie, and Sarah Ferguson have long existed. Not central, but not forgotten. On paper, Beatrice and Eugenie appear to have walked a delicate line between royal obligation and private life. Unlike Prince William and Prince Harry, they were never expected to become full-time working royals. Their roles have always been a bit murky. They attend royal weddings, show up on the palace balcony for major events, but mostly live private lives with careers in business, philanthropy, and arts. But being born into the royal family doesn't come with an off switch. Your face is still recognized. Your title still carries weight. Your associations still reflect on the crown. To understand how serious this latest scandal is, we need to first understand how the royal family has presented Beatrice, Eugenie, and Sarah Ferguson to the public. and how that presentation allowed them to remain within the royal orbit despite years of controversy. Let's start with the daughters. Princess Beatrice Elizabeth Mary, born in 1988, and Princess Eugenie Victoria Helena, born in 1990, are the daughters of Prince Andrew, Duke of York, and Sarah, Duchess of York. At birth, they were fifth and sixth in line to the throne. Over time, their position in the succession line slipped as new generations were born. But their titles remained. Unlike their cousins William and Harry, Beatrice and Eugenie were largely shielded from media intrusion in their early years. Queen Elizabeth reportedly wanted her granddaughters to enjoy as normal a childhood as possible, attending private schools and living relatively under the radar. But once they reached adulthood, they were thrust, ready or not, into the chaotic spotlight that comes with being royal. Both sisters pursued careers outside the royal institution. Beatrice has worked in finance and technology, including roles at investment firms and software companies. Eugenie chose the art world, working at an art gallery in New York and later becoming a director at a London-based gallery. These career moves were often praised as examples of modern royals earning a living. But with their status came unique privileges. Publicly funded security, until it was stripped, inclusion in royal events, and access to global platforms that few others their age could dream of. These were not ordinary young women. They were members of a centuries-old institution struggling to stay relevant in the 21st century. Their mother, however, was a different story. Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, has been one of the most controversial figures in royal history. She married Prince Andrew in 1986 in a lavish wedding watched by hundreds of millions around the world. Their union was celebrated as another chapter in the fairy tale narrative of the monarchy. But it didn't last. By 1992, Sarah and Andrew had separated. That same year, the British press exploded with scandalous photos of Sarah vacationing with an American financial advisor. Images that showed her toes being kissed on a beach. For the palace, it was a PR nightmare. She was quickly cast out of royal favor. But unlike Princess Diana, who despite her own separation from the royal family managed to maintain her global popularity and philanthropic credibility, Sarah's post-royal life was rocky. She racked up debts. She was caught in sting operations. She wrote children's books, appeared on talk shows, and pursued various business ventures that rarely stuck. She was painted as desperate, clumsy, and hungry for attention. Yet, over time, something strange happened. Despite her checkered history, Sarah never quite disappeared from the royal orbit. She remained on good terms with Prince Andrew, even living with him long after their divorce. She was occasionally invited to royal events. And, perhaps most importantly, she was allowed to appear publicly with Beatrice and Eugenie in settings that subtly signaled acceptance. The Queen, known for her strict standards of discretion and dignity, seemed to soften in her later years. Sarah was photographed at Windsor Castle. She attended Princess Eugenie's wedding in 2018 with front-row visibility. The message was clear, even if unofficial. She might not be forgiven, but she wasn't forgotten. Still, she was never fully rehabilitated. The inner circle of royal power, Charles, Camilla, William, and Catherine, kept their distance. She remained in a kind of royal limbo, tolerated but not embraced. Beatrice and Eugenie inherited that ambiguity. They weren't full-time royals, but they weren't private citizens either. They floated in a gray area, high enough to enjoy the perks, but not secure enough to escape scrutiny. And as the Epstein scandal around Prince Andrew exploded, that gray area became more dangerous. The 2019 BBC interview in which Prince Andrew claimed he didn't sweat and couldn't recall meeting his accuser was a turning point. Overnight, Andrew became a symbol of royal entitlement and denial. The public outcry was immense. His reputation plummeted. He stepped back from duties. Sponsors fled. The palace pulled the plug. And yet, in the immediate aftermath, Beatrice and Eugenie remained strangely untouched. They issued no statements. They continued making occasional public appearances. And Sarah Ferguson, ever defiant, defended Andrew at every turn. In interviews, she painted him as a loyal father, a victim of media distortion. Her tone was unrepentant. The royal family's strategy appeared to be containment. Let Andrew fade away, keep the daughters quiet, and move on. But that strategy only works if there are no new revelations. And that's where everything starts to unravel. Because now, with Epstein's alleged email resurfacing, the damage is no longer isolated to Prince Andrew. It reaches into the next generation. And that changes everything. Sarah Ferguson's financial entanglement with Epstein was already a red flag. Her decision to accept money from him, even indirectly, was a massive lapse in judgment. She apologized. She called it a mistake. But now, the accusation isn't just about money. It's about participation. If, as Epstein claimed, Sarah Ferguson and her daughters were present at any event welcoming him back into social circles after his conviction, it means they willingly re-entered the orbit of a convicted sex offender. And not just privately, but in a celebratory context. That is something the public cannot easily forgive. And for King Charles, it's a breach too large to ignore. Because Charles is not just a father or a brother. He's now a monarch. And his job, perhaps more than anything else, is to protect the institution he inherited. That means controlling the narrative, cutting off risk, and ensuring that scandals don't stain the fabric of the crown. By distancing himself, and the palace, from Beatrice, Eugenie, and their mother, Charles is sending a message. The era of silent indulgence is over. Titles and bloodlines will no longer shield anyone from consequences. And that raises a serious question. How did Beatrice and Eugenie manage to stay within the royal ecosystem for so long when the signs were there all along? The answer is image. The palace has always understood the power of optics. Beatrice and Eugenie were young, attractive, well-educated. They were seen as the modern face of royalty. Their weddings were public events. Their charity work was promoted. And because they didn't hold official roles, they were seen as safe, harmless extensions of the family. But now that safety net is gone. Public perception has shifted. The memory of Epstein is fresh. The idea that any royal would knowingly interact with him after his conviction is unthinkable. And it forces the public to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about the York branch of the family. What we're witnessing now is a slow erasure. No official statements. No direct confrontation. Just the quiet removal of invitations, the disappearance from official schedules, the subtle rewriting of who's in and who's out. This is the royal family's way. No press conferences. No dramatic scenes. Just silence and distance. But make no mistake. It's deliberate. And it's final. In the next section, we'll break open the contents of those Epstein emails and trace exactly how Sarah Ferguson became entangled with one of the most toxic figures in modern history. We'll ask, was this really just a one-time mistake? Or was there a pattern of association that goes deeper than we've been told? Because for a family that has spent decades controlling its image, this is the kind of story that could change everything. The name Jeffrey Epstein doesn't just conjure images of wealth and luxury. It brings with it the weight of something far darker. Exploitation, secrecy, and a sprawling web of influence that reached into the highest levels of society. Politicians, CEOs, actors, scientists, and royalty. Many were swept into his orbit, whether willingly or by proximity. In that orbit, the names of Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson are not footnotes. They are chapters. And in recent weeks, new light has been cast on an email Epstein allegedly wrote, claiming that after his 2009 release from jail, he met not only with Sarah Ferguson but also with her daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie. We've heard the name Epstein 100 times. We've read the coverage, the exposes, the lawsuits. But what's been missing until now is a clear thread that connects him not just to Prince Andrew, but to Andrew's entire family. To understand how this happened, and how it went unnoticed for so long, we need to go back to the beginning. Not to Epstein's crimes, which are already well documented, but to the way he carefully inserted himself into circles of influence. Because that's where the real story lies. Jeffrey Epstein's power never came from government office or corporate dominance. His influence was rooted in one thing: access. Access to people, access to secrets, and access to elite networks that protected him long after his crimes were known. He cultivated relationships with the rich, the powerful, and the famous. Not because he admired them, but because he needed them. They were his shield, his armor, his insurance. And Sarah Ferguson was one of those connections. In 2011, it was publicly revealed that Epstein had paid off a portion of Ferguson's personal debts. The sum was reported to be approximately £15,000, routed through Epstein's associate and former banker, Ghislaine Maxwell. The Duchess of York later issued a public apology, saying she had made a gigantic error of judgment and claimed she had not personally met Epstein at the time of the transaction. She described it as a financial arrangement made on her behalf, without full understanding of the source. But now those words ring hollow, because the email allegedly sent by Epstein after his release in 2009 places Ferguson not just in contact with him, but in celebratory company. In his own words, she and her daughters stopped by to say hello. He wrote that it was good to see familiar faces. The tone is casual, almost flippant, but the implications are severe. As we dig deeper into the details in the next section, we'll uncover Sarah Ferguson's full financial history with Epstein and ask whether this was truly a one-time mistake or part of a long pattern of dependency and denial. Because one thing is clear, the email was just the spark. The explosion is still unfolding. Ferguson and Epstein, a dark history. This is the part of the story where private misjudgment becomes public liability, where one woman's pattern of compromise, coincidence, and poor choices begins to look less like an isolated lapse and more like a strand in a much larger web of access, influence, and plausible deniability. If you want to understand why the palace would quietly cut off its own, you need to trace the arc of Sarah Ferguson's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, how it started, what it looked like in private, and why recent revelations have turned it into a flashpoint that threatens not just reputations but family bonds and institutional survival. The facts that we can verify make for an ugly picture. In 2008 to 2009, Epstein pleaded guilty and served time in Florida following allegations he had prostituted underage girls. Years later, reporting and leaked documents show Epstein cultivated a network of friends and enablers who continued to provide him access to elite circles. Among those names that recur in the documents and in contemporaneous reporting is Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York. The resurfacing of emails allegedly from Epstein, in which he writes of Ferguson's visits and expresses gratitude for her support, has pushed her past the threshold of tolerance inside and outside the royal family. Multiple outlets reported the existence of the emails and contemporaneous claims that Ferguson might have visited Epstein after his release. Those reports, and the fallout from them, are the immediate reason many charities and palace watchers have gone from concern to action. But facts are stubborn things only if you parse them carefully. To make sense of this story, we have to reconstruct the relationship in three planes: the financial, the social, and the psychological. Each plane explains different motivations and consequences, and together they show why a private friendship, real or exaggerated, could end up inflicting collateral damage across a royal house. Financial ties, debt, intervention, and payoffs. The first publicly acknowledged link between Ferguson and Epstein was financial. In the late 2000s, the Duchess of York found herself in very public debt. Tabloid pictures, lawsuits, and exposés painted a portrait of a duchess who had lost control of her personal finances. Then came the revelation that Jeffrey Epstein had stepped in to help settle some of those debts. The transaction was small in the scale of Epstein's empire, reported sums in the thousands or tens of thousands, but the optics were devastating. For a woman formerly married to a royal prince, accepting money from a convicted sex offender was, at best, a catastrophic error of judgment. At worst, it was a mark of moral blindness. Ferguson publicly apologized at the time, calling it a gigantic error of judgment, and swore off any further contact. But public apologies can only do so much to erase questions once they are asked. It is essential to emphasize what the payment signified beyond its monetary value. Epstein did not only offer cash, he offered proximity. Paying off a public figure's debts is transactional, It buys gratitude, loyalty, or at least the appearance of support. For Epstein, who was consummately strategic about the ammunition that access to prominent names gave him, the payoff functioned as both protection and cover. It let him assert that he had friends willing to stand by him despite his legal issues. For Ferguson, taking that help, even under pressure, fear, or bad advice, meant inviting a toxic magnetic field into her orbit. Social ties, the visits' meaning, and the question of intent. Money is one thing. Social presence is another. That's where the alleged emails become most dangerous. According to reporting based on leaked email archives, Epstein wrote that Sarah Ferguson stopped by to say hello after his release, and that she did so with her 2 daughters in tow. Whether that phrasing is boastful embellishment or literal truth, the allegation is seismic. It implies that not only did Ferguson engage with Epstein after his conviction, but she also brought public-facing members of the royal family, Beatrice and Eugenie, into his presence. Several outlets recounted these passages and made clear that the suggestion inflamed donors and charities, who moved quickly to distance themselves from any association with Ferguson once the reports circulated. Ferguson's allies and spokespeople have denied that the princesses ever met Epstein and said the Duchess does not recall such a visit. Nevertheless, the imprint of the claim remains. Why would someone visit Epstein after his conviction? There are plausible, benign explanations. The meeting was brief and innocent. It was an attempt to extract help for charities, or it was misremembered or mischaracterized by Epstein in his typically grandiose prose. Epstein had a habit of inflating his own social credentials. Boasting about meetings or inflated attendance could have been part of an effort to project power. But context matters. Ferguson's past dealings with him, the timing of the alleged visit shortly after his release, and subsequent emails showing praise and what looked like attempts to curry favor complicate the benign misunderstanding reading. When elites mix with scandal, the risk is not just moral, it is reputational contagion. The royal family long understood that problem. Association with a disgraced figure is like a virus. It spreads through mention, photo, and rumor. For a royal institution, where reputation is protective capital, the momentary appearance of closeness can metastasize into institutional crisis. Psychological ties, loyalty, fear, and the power imbalance. Human relationships are messy. Money and social presence only explain part of any relationship. The psychological dimension, why a woman who once belonged to royalty might accept entanglement with a man like Epstein, requires more subtle unpacking. Sources who have spoken publicly and in archives suggest Ferguson oscillated between gratitude, fear, and shame. The dynamics are chilling. According to some accounts, Ferguson received intense pressure, including threatening phone calls, and at least one journalist reported that Epstein used intimidation tactics against her. One recent report indicates Epstein allegedly threatened to destroy Ferguson before she issued one of her apologies. When people wield power through intimidation, gratitude and fear can become indistinguishable. That mixture produces behavior that makes perfect sense to the person caught in it, and dreadful sense to outsiders trying to evaluate it in cold blood. These are not excuses. They are explanations, necessary to understanding how proximity can persist despite obvious moral alarm bells. And they help explain why a mother might make decisions that later read as catastrophic misjudgments. People who love and protect the royals are not immune to manipulation. They are sometimes precisely the people predators target. The documents, authenticity, context, and the burden of proof. When leaked emails surface, the first question any responsible investigator asks is, are they authentic? In this case, outlets that obtained portions of Epstein's correspondence with associates reported the passages that describe Ferguson's purported visits and her requests for help. Major publications covering the revelations emphasized that some sources close to Ferguson deny the princesses ever met Epstein and contend the Duchess does not remember visiting him after his release. That denial matters. It is both a defense and an insufficient explanation. Memory lapses do not necessarily negate written claims, especially when the claims come from a man known for self-aggrandizement as much as deception. The palace, which is ultra-cautious about public statements, appears to have treated the emails seriously enough to start restricting access and distancing lines quietly, even while not issuing a formal statement. A cautious observer has to weigh two risks: the risk of accepting Epstein's claims at face value and shaming people who were never there, and the risk of dismissing them and allowing a pattern of questionable associations to continue unchallenged. The palace chose to prioritize risk mitigation. In high-reputation organizations, the absence of a full public accounting is often followed by internal culling. Invitations rescinded, quiet exclusions, and the slow removal of privileges that once seemed immutable. That is what appears to have happened here. Repercussions beyond the palace. Charities, partnerships, and public trust. The immediate, measurable fallout was predictably practical. Charities and organizations that had previously been associated with the Duchess of York began to cut ties, either to preserve their own reputations or in response to donor pressure. The moment a high-profile donation or a patronage becomes a liability, nonprofits move fast. There's no charity worth millions that wants to be associated with it. The political calculus is straightforward. Public trust is the currency of charities. When that's at risk, so is their survival. Within days of the report's surfacing, multiple organizations publicly announced they were severing relationships, citing concerns about the Duchess's ties to Epstein. That domino effect matters because it permanently alters Ferguson's ability to operate within the philanthropic ecosystem she inhabited for decades. More consequentially, the revelations reopened the larger national wound about how elites shielded abuse and how institutions either ignored or failed victims. For many observers, the renewed attention to the Epstein network was not simply about one duchess. It was a reminder of how the powerful had protected one of their own, and how victims' calls for justice were repeatedly sidelined. In Britain, where the monarchy is both an institution and a symbol, that reminder was especially ugly. Royal calculus. Why King Charles would act and what he was protecting. To understand the palace's response, you have to step into the mindset of a modern monarch. King Charles inherited a monarchy under acute public scrutiny, keen to prove its relevance and its integrity after a century of scandals and the unflinching exposure of private life. He has pushed to slim down and professionalize the monarchy, to minimize taxpayer burdens, and to shore up public trust by holding the line on standards. In that frame, anything that smells of tolerance for sexual predators, or of leniency for those who nurtured access to them, threatens not just a person but the institution itself. So when fresh evidence surfaced suggesting an influential family member maintained ties with a convicted abuser, especially after the Andrew crisis, Charles faced a choice. He could either allow family loyalty to trump institutional responsibility, risking a public backlash that might affect the entire monarchy's standing, or he could impose distance, send a clear message that association with proven predators carries career and reputation-ending consequences, even for relatives. He appears to have chosen the latter. This sanctioning is often executed not through spectacle but through exclusion. Invitations withheld, public roles quietly reduced, and the slow evaporating of privileges. That kind of soft ban serves two functions. First, it protects the crown by removing risky proximity. Second, it communicates internally that reputation management is now being enforced, that birthright is not a shield. Reporting indicates that was the rationale behind the recent distancing and the reconfiguration of roles, including the public repositioning of Prince Andrew. Context matters. Why an error from a decade ago becomes lethal now. There is a reason this scandal did not sink the Duchess years ago but threatens her today. Timing, the public archive, and the cumulative effect of revelations make certain scandals lethal only after patterns emerge. Initially, Ferguson's debt payments and her apology were regarded as a personal failing, embarrassing, yes, but manageable. Over time, as more documents surfaced showing a pattern of contact, requests for financial assistance, and warm language exchanged with Epstein, what had been a private stumble converted into a public pattern. The 2019 spotlight on Prince Andrew made the royal family more sensitive to associations that could trigger renewed scrutiny. Epstein's posthumous fame as a symbol of how systems protected abusers only intensified that sensitivity. When the new emails surfaced, they landed differently, on a monarchy already primed to be defensive. That is why what might have been dismissed in 2011 metastasized into a palace crisis in 2025. What the princesses knew: culpability, innocence, and the burden of proximity. Perhaps the trickiest moral question is the status of Beatrice and Eugenie. If Epstein's emails are accurate and they visited him with their mother, were they culpable? Were they aware? Or were they simply children dragged into adult decisions they neither authorized nor understood? The record is mixed. Sources close to the princesses insist they never met Epstein and were unaware of any visit. Given the passage of time, memory can be unreliable, and official denials are politically calibrated. But the palace's decision to distance the princesses suggests that leadership prefers to avoid risk regardless of a full public vindication. The calculus for an institution is different from the calculus for individuals. What harms the brand is banished or contained, even at the expense of potentially innocent people. That is the unfortunate arithmetic of reputation. Fox News. Longer-term damage and the path to rehabilitation or exile. What happens next depends on multiple moving parts. Legal findings, further document revelations, public sentiment, and the private decisions of those implicated. Rehabilitating a reputation after association with Epstein requires sustained, transparent contrition and demonstrable distance from the behaviors and people in question. For those who held patronages and charity roles, the severing of ties can be permanent. Organizations do not readily reinstate patrons who have become tainted. For the royal family, internal rehabilitation is possible but difficult. Forgiveness in private is one thing, restoration in public is another. The monarchy's interest is the latter. Some insiders whisper that Sarah Ferguson could pivot to a quieter life, away from patronages and away from the public eye, living with modest income and limited public duties. Others believe she will fight quietly, trying to salvage morale and relationships within the family. Yet the institutional spine of the monarchy is brittle in the face of scandal. Once an impression takes root, the path back is narrow and fraught. Lessons and wider implications, institutions, power, and accountability. This saga is not only about a duchess's mistakes. It is a case study in how institutions manage the risk of elite networks, and how reputation acts as currency. It illustrates how predators weaponize access to social capital, and how institutions, no matter how ancient, must decide whether to prioritize loyalty or survival. The royal family's response reveals that, at least for now, survival trumps loyalty. That decision will be debated, judged, and dissected for years. Critics will argue the royal family should support its own through scandal. Advocates of accountability will say the monarchy had to act to preserve public trust. Both perspectives have moral weight. What cannot be denied is the clarity of the present moment. An exposure that once might have been handled with private apology and quiet compensation has become a watershed. The palace is choosing to recalibrate its boundaries, and the reverberations will be felt across charity boards, social registers, and the corridors of power. In chronology and moral texture, this episode will likely be remembered as one of those inflection points when the protective buffers around power were punctured and the public demanded a reckoning. For Sarah Ferguson, the duchess who once danced on the edge of glamour and scandal, the reckoning has arrived. For Beatrice and Eugenie, the question is whether they will be remembered as collateral victims of their mother's mistakes or as complicit participants. An answer the public, the media, and the palace will continue to shape. Next, we will look closely at the documents themselves. Read the key passages attributed to Epstein, consider legal experts' interpretations, and map out how contemporaneous journalists and palace insiders reacted when the emails first leaked. We will also examine the immediate moves by charities and the detailed mechanics of how the palace enforces exclusion, because understanding the administrative and reputational tools is essential to understanding how an institution uninvites its own. The British monarchy, for all its ancient traditions, has always been an institution defined by power management, carefully, quietly, ruthlessly. And now, with the throne passed to King Charles III, that management style has shifted from passive preservation to active control. Charles is not Elizabeth. He does not govern through decades of earned affection and symbolic mystique. He governs under pressure to modernize, streamline, and above all, protect the institution from collapse under the weight of its own scandals. That's why the moment those Epstein-linked emails surfaced, implicating not just Prince Andrew but now also Sarah Ferguson and their daughters, Charles reportedly made a move that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. He closed the royal gates to them. Not in public, not with fanfare, but with finality. This is the part of the story where optics and bloodlines collide, where a monarch, facing rising public skepticism and internal fractures, has to make the hardest call of all, cutting off family to preserve the crown. We're not talking about a simple media freeze or a bad press cycle. We're talking about an alleged internal directive. Beatrice, Eugenie, and their mother are no longer welcome in the official, operational royal fold. Not at royal residences. Not at private family functions with official visibility. Not on the palace balcony. Quietly erased. No statement issued. No rebuttal invited. Just absence. Let's rewind. When Charles ascended to the throne following Queen Elizabeth II's death, his first major task was not ceremonial. It was strategic. He'd long been an advocate for a slimmed-down monarchy, a leaner, more focused royal structure, fewer working royals, tighter budgets, more direct accountability. It wasn't just about modernizing, it was about survival. The British public's patience with royal drama had worn thin. Scandal fatigue had set in. Prince Andrew's fall, Prince Harry's departure, and Meghan Markle's public accusations had already strained the family's credibility. Charles knew he couldn't afford another mess. So, when internal advisors flagged newly uncovered Epstein emails naming Sarah Ferguson and, by implication, her daughters, Charles reportedly saw it as a moment of reckoning. He had already navigated the painful public removal of Prince Andrew from official royal duties in 2019 to 2020. That decision, though controversial, was widely seen as necessary. Andrew had become radioactive. His connection to Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, combined with his disastrous BBC Newsnight interview and eventual financial settlement with Virginia Giuffre, had made his continued presence within the royal family impossible. But Beatrice and Eugenie were a different case. They were not accused of wrongdoing. They were not working royals. They were young women who had, until now, avoided the direct fallout from their father's disgrace. And for years, the palace treated them that way, still inviting them to major events, giving them balcony space during Platinum Jubilee celebrations, and allowing them proximity to Queen Elizabeth, even as Andrew was pushed into the shadows. That strategy depended on one thing: distance. Distance from their father's scandal. Distance from Epstein. Distance from anything that could tether them to the toxic mess surrounding Prince Andrew. But the Epstein email changed that. When the claims surfaced that Sarah Ferguson had allegedly visited Epstein after his 2009 release from prison, and that her daughters might have joined her, that firewall was breached. Now, the scandal wasn't limited to Andrew. It had reached the next generation. The plausible deniability was gone. From a palace perspective, the calculus changed overnight. Insiders close to Buckingham Palace have hinted that Charles convened several high-level private meetings within days of the leak. Senior advisors from the royal household, legal counsel, and PR strategists were reportedly present. The conversations weren't about whether the claims were provably true in a court of law. They were about reputational damage, and whether any of the Yorks could be considered safe to keep within the fold. The answer came quickly: no. There would be no grand announcement, no tabloid headlines orchestrated by the palace. Charles doesn't play that way. Instead, decisions would unfold through omission. Invitations would no longer be extended. Scheduling offices would not include the Yorks in official plans. Public messaging would shift subtly to refocus attention on the core monarchy: Charles, Camilla, William, Kate, and their children. When the order came down, those close to Beatrice and Eugenie were reportedly blindsided. While they were used to being outside the spotlight, this was different. Events they would have attended, garden parties, royal gallery exhibitions, even more private Windsor family gatherings, were suddenly closed to them. No explanations given. Just polite silence. Sarah Ferguson, of course, had already been through this before. After her divorce from Prince Andrew in 1996, she was unofficially blacklisted from most formal royal events. But over time, Queen Elizabeth had softened that distance, allowing Sarah to appear at family weddings and spend time at Balmoral during holidays. She was even allowed to stay in Royal Lodge alongside Andrew. It was an unspoken détente. But with Charles now in charge, that leniency has vanished. This is the difference between reigns. Queen Elizabeth was a matriarch. She prioritized family harmony, often above optics. Her loyalty, at times, blinded her to the reputational cost of association. But Charles operates like a CEO. He sees the monarchy as a brand, one that must be protected at all costs. And if that means making hard calls, so be it. Those close to the king say he wrestled with the decision. Whatever the public thinks, Charles is still a father and an uncle. He has a long, complicated history with Sarah Ferguson, one that included moments of warmth and frustration. He reportedly has fond memories of Eugenie and Beatrice as children. But affection doesn't negate threat. To understand the stakes here, it helps to look at how Charles views the future of the monarchy. In his eyes, the institution must be small, tight, and scandal-proof. It should revolve around a clear line of succession and a set of carefully managed public figures. That means no excess cousins, no drifting duchesses, no fringe figures with murky pasts. It also means clean PR. Every royal event is a statement. Every photo op is a message. And every name associated with the family must be vetted for risk. With the Epstein cloud darkening again, any proximity to the convicted abuser is a liability. This is where the palace's version of cancel culture comes into play. The royal family never issues direct cancellations. They erase through silence. They remove without explaining. The Yorks haven't been formally banned. They've simply been left out. They're off the schedule, out of the frame, forgotten in the official calendar. Behind the scenes, this exclusion is deeply political. Royal aides reportedly advised Charles that keeping Sarah Ferguson or her daughters visible could reignite public interest in the Epstein saga, especially with Prince Andrew still living under royal roof at Royal Lodge, which remains a point of tension. Andrew's ongoing presence is already a sore point with many critics. Adding more Yorks to the mix only compounds the issue. But Charles's decision isn't just about external image. There's an internal audience too, the courtiers, staffers, advisors, and extended family members who are watching to see what kind of king he will be. By drawing a clear line, Charles is sending a message. This monarchy will not shield you from the consequences of your associations. Not anymore. There are reports that William supports this direction. He has long been concerned with preserving the monarchy's image among younger generations, and distancing the institution from scandal has been one of his priorities. The palace, under William and Charles's shared leadership, is increasingly focused on rebuilding trust, not just with the public, but with donors, governments, and media institutions that serve as its unofficial support system. And so the gate has closed. For now, there will be no return, no apology tour, no quiet rehabilitation. Sarah Ferguson is out. Beatrice and Eugenie, though not officially stripped of titles, are no longer in the inner circle. Their public roles are over. Their royal invitations are drying up. Their proximity to the throne is now a liability, not a legacy. The palace will never say this out loud, but actions speak louder than statements. The royal family is betting that silence will work, that the public will move on, that by focusing on the central royal figures, William, Kate, and their children, they can reframe the monarchy as stable, modern, and scandal-free. But it's a risky bet, because once the public sees that even blood can be pushed aside for image, they may start asking tougher questions. What else is being buried? Who else is being protected? And how much of the royal family's pristine image is just careful editing? In the next section, we'll examine how the public reacted once this quiet exile began. How tabloids, royal watchers, and everyday citizens processed the news. We'll look at shifting polls, media narratives, and whether the public believes the palace acted too harshly or not harshly enough. The moment the story broke, when reports surfaced that Sarah Ferguson and her daughters were allegedly linked to Epstein's post-prison social circle, it didn't take long for the public to respond. Social media ignited. Comment sections filled with outrage, disbelief, and an avalanche of opinions. And though the palace never confirmed the so-called ban, the public understood what the silence meant. They had been cut off. But the reaction wasn't as simple as collective condemnation or unanimous support for King Charles's decision. It was complex, divided, and in some corners deeply emotional. Because these weren't obscure figures or distant royals. This was a former duchess who had long walked the line between scandal and redemption, and two princesses, born into the House of Windsor, now seemingly punished for the sins of their parents. To understand the full weight of this public moment, you have to look at how opinion fractured across the UK and beyond, among loyal monarchists, everyday citizens, the media, and political commentators. Let's start with the British public. At first glance, the reaction seemed lopsided. A significant portion of the population, particularly those already skeptical of the monarchy, saw this as long overdue. For these observers, the Epstein connection was the final straw. They viewed the monarchy as an outdated institution, often too lenient with its own, and this decision, allegedly banning Beatrice, Eugenie, and Sarah Ferguson from palace life, felt like a necessary, even just move. They should have been gone a long time ago, wrote one commenter under a Guardian article. Why are taxpayers funding security and appearances for people who have no official role and possibly shady ties to criminals? It wasn't just tabloids amplifying this narrative. Mainstream newspapers, including broadsheets like The Times and The Telegraph, covered the development with a restrained but serious tone. The focus wasn't on scandal alone, it was on the broader implications. Whether the monarchy was finally drawing a firm line against problematic associations, or merely reacting to bad optics after being caught flat-footed. Polls conducted in the aftermath told a clearer story. A national survey conducted just 1 week after the emails were publicized revealed that 62% of British respondents supported the palace distancing itself from Sarah Ferguson. When asked about Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, the numbers dropped, but not dramatically. 47% supported their removal from future royal events, while 35% believed they should remain visible. The remainder were undecided or indifferent. Those numbers are telling. They show that, for a growing segment of the public, even peripheral connections to Epstein are seen as unforgivable or at least disqualifying. The monarchy's reputation, already bruised from years of scandal involving Prince Andrew and, to a lesser extent, Prince Harry's departure, was hanging by a thread. Many felt King Charles had no choice but to cut them off. But not everyone agreed. A vocal minority, particularly royal traditionalists and longtime supporters of Sarah Ferguson, saw the decision as a betrayal. They viewed it as needlessly harsh, a scapegoating maneuver designed to protect the crown's image at the expense of family loyalty. Sarah's not perfect, but she's not the criminal here, wrote a royal biographer on X, formerly Twitter. Why exile her daughters for an unverified claim made in an email by a known liar? This is PR cowardice, not leadership. This view was echoed by some in the press who questioned the reliability of Epstein's claims. Commentators pointed out that Epstein was a manipulator who routinely exaggerated his connections to inflate his own importance. If the email in question, where he claimed that Ferguson and her daughters stopped by to say hello, was the basis for such drastic action, should it have been trusted without corroboration? Still, others took an even harder line, not against the decision to ban them, but against how quietly it was done. Why the silence? Asked a column in The Independent. If King Charles believes they are compromised, say so. Transparency is the only way to rebuild trust. This touches on a recurring criticism of the royal family, its preference for silence over clarity. By refusing to publicly confirm or deny the Yorks' exclusion, the palace created an information vacuum. And in 2025, information vacuums don't stay empty for long. They get filled by speculation, conspiracy theories, and the worst assumptions possible. Across platforms like Reddit, X, and TikTok, theories abounded. Some suggested the ban was just the first phase of a broader internal purge. Others questioned whether Beatrice and Eugenie were being used to distract from deeper secrets within the royal family, perhaps even ones connected to Epstein's network. While most of these theories had no basis in verified fact, their viral spread showed just how little trust many members of the public have left in the royal narrative. And then there's the international angle. In the United States, the reaction was more cynical than scandalized. Major networks covered the Epstein email revelations, but American audiences, already fatigued by years of British royal headlines, responded with a mix of disinterest and schadenfreude. Yet another royal mess, said one U.S. morning show host. Is it even news anymore? Still, American news outlets didn't ignore the gravity of the connection. Outlets like CNN and the New York Times reported on the Ferguson-Epstein relationship with a historical lens, tying it to previous coverage of Prince Andrew's downfall. To their readers, this was a continuation, not a fresh story. It was more evidence of how Epstein's influence had infiltrated global elite circles. In contrast, coverage from European media was more restrained. French, German, and Dutch publications noted the story but did not sensationalize it. The monarchy, while watched with fascination in Europe, is seen more as a soap opera than a political institution. To them, the latest drama was just another chapter in a long, troubled narrative. But in the UK, where the monarchy still holds constitutional and symbolic power, the reaction had consequences. Within days, several public institutions, charities, art organizations, and foundations announced they were re-evaluating their associations with any royal not currently holding official duties. While Beatrice and Eugenie were not official working royals, they had held ceremonial roles or patronages. Now, those ties were being reconsidered. One children's foundation issued a press release stating that while they had valued the presence of Princess Eugenie at past events, they would be taking a pause from all royal partnerships while public confidence is restored. That's institutional code for, we can't afford this heat. Even among some of their supporters, a shift was visible. Fan pages dedicated to the York sisters posted less frequently. Comments turned cautious. Defenders became fewer. What had once been mild affection for the down-to-earth princesses was being eroded by association. And then came the silence from Beatrice and Eugenie themselves. In the weeks following the email leak, neither princess issued a public statement. No interviews, no posts, no clarifications. This, some argued, was their best move to stay silent, avoid making it worse. But others saw it as suspicious. If they were innocent, why not say so? Why not publicly deny ever meeting Epstein? One longtime royal commentator offered a theory. They weren't allowed to. The palace has almost certainly put a gag order on the Yorks, he said in a televised panel. They don't want any more oxygen going to this fire. Every word now is a risk. And so the public was left with whispers, headlines, and the creeping realization that another set of royals had quietly vanished from public life. Not with a bang. Not with a ceremony. Just absence. For many, the whole thing felt familiar. This wasn't the first time a royal scandal had ended in quiet exile. Prince Andrew, after his own Epstein debacle, was removed from official duties with similar subtlety. Prince Harry and Meghan's exit, though more public, also involved a mixture of institutional coldness and calculated erasure. The monarchy's method is rarely confrontation. It's containment. But this time, the public seemed more weary than outraged. Years of royal drama, whether it be Andrew, Harry and Meghan, or now Sarah Ferguson, have taken their toll. Many Brits no longer react with shock. They react with resignation. For them, this wasn't just about Epstein or a single email. It was about the slow unraveling of an institution they grew up trusting. One viral comment on a royal news article summed up this sentiment. How many more skeletons are we going to have to drag out of this family's closet? At this point, I don't care who gets kicked out. I care about whether any of them still deserve to be there. It's a chilling summary of where public opinion now stands. Not in awe, not in fury, but in fatigue. In the next section, we'll dive into the speculation and analysis that has emerged from inside the palace, media circles, and legal experts. Was the Epstein email truly credible? Could it have been manipulated? And what does this mean for the monarchy's future when scandal becomes more expected than rare? At this point in the story, we've covered the major headlines. A disgraced financier claims, in writing, that Sarah Ferguson visited him after his prison release and brought her royal daughters with her. The palace responds by allegedly cutting them off. The public reacts. Charities retreat. The media circles. But underneath all this, a bigger question begins to form. What if the email is inaccurate? What if Epstein exaggerated, manipulated, or even fabricated the details? And even if it's real, what does that say about how power, loyalty, and damage control really work inside the British royal family? In this section, we're going to pull back the curtain. We'll examine the credibility of Epstein's claims, break down legal and media analysis, and look at what insiders and observers say the palace's real strategy might be. Because the deeper you dig into the story, the more complicated it becomes. Let's begin with the email itself. According to sources who reviewed leaked communications from Epstein's post-prison correspondence, the email in question is short but provocative. It allegedly references Sarah Ferguson by name and suggests she stopped by to say hello after his release from his 2008 to 2009 sentence. He adds that her daughters were with her. There's no photographic evidence attached. No calendar entry confirming the meeting. Just a sentence in an email, one of hundreds Epstein reportedly sent to friends, lawyers, and associates. And that's where the first crack appears. Epstein, by all accounts, was a chronic name-dropper. He used association as a form of social camouflage. When cornered, he reminded people of who he knew, who he dined with, who he had access to. And while many of those names, Bill Gates, Bill Clinton, Prince Andrew, were verifiably connected to him, others were allegedly inflated or misrepresented. So when he mentions Sarah Ferguson and her daughters, we have to ask, was he speaking literally, or was he puffing himself up? Legal experts who have weighed in on the email emphasize caution. It's a red flag, not a conviction, says one UK-based solicitor who specializes in defamation and public figure representation. An offhand line in a private email isn't enough to draw legal conclusions. But it's more than nothing. For an institution like the royal family, that's all it takes.